There's a stretch of water in the Caribbean that sailors call the Boulevard. It's a name that drips with irony, because while boulevards are supposed to be safe, wide, well-traveled roads, this particular passage has claimed more vessels in the last decade than almost any other route in the Caribbean. The paradox is maddening. This isn't some treacherous, reef-strewn nightmare or a notorious hurricane alley. On paper, it's one of the safest passages in the entire Caribbean Sea. The weather patterns are predictable. The charts are detailed down to the last coral head. The marine traffic is constant, meaning help is never far away. And yet boats disappear here. Expensive boats, well-equipped boats, boats captained by experienced sailors who should know better. What you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you think about maritime safety, because the real danger lurking in this passage isn't written on any chart, and it can't be predicted by any weather forecast. It's a killer that hides in plain sight, and it's already claimed its next victim before the anchor is even raised. In this investigation, we're going to dissect the wreckage of dreams, examine the final logbook entries of sailors who thought they were making a routine passage, and reveal the psychological trap that turns a safe route into a graveyard. We're going to follow one crew's journey from confident departure to catastrophic disaster, and along the way, you'll see how every decision they made, every calculation they trusted, every assumption they carried, led them inexorably toward the moment when everything fell apart. This is a story that every sailor needs to hear, because what happened to them could happen to anyone who underestimates the ocean's ability to punish complacency. The lesson written in their wreckage could save your life. Meet Richard and Caroline Breslin. Richard was 62, a retired aerospace engineer from Seattle, with 3 decades of experience in systems analysis and risk management. Caroline was 59, a former emergency room nurse who'd spent her career making life-or-death decisions under pressure. These weren't reckless thrill seekers or naive weekend warriors. These were methodical, intelligent people who approached sailing with the same rigorous discipline they'd applied to their professional lives. For 18 years, a photograph had occupied a place of honor on their refrigerator. It showed a Mason 43 cutter-rigged sailboat gleaming white against impossibly blue water. Beneath it, in Richard's neat engineering script, were the words, "Our someday." That photograph wasn't just a dream, it was a plan. When Richard retired in 2019, the plan kicked into action. They didn't rush out and buy the first boat they saw. That wasn't their style. Instead, they spent 8 months researching, attending boat shows, surveying used vessels, and interviewing surveyors and riggers. They took courses: advanced coastal navigation at the Seattle Sailing Club, offshore safety and survival training in Vancouver, marine diesel mechanics at a community college. Caroline became certified in marine first aid and emergency medical procedures specific to offshore sailing. Richard studied weather routing and learned to interpret GRIB files like he once analyzed aerospace telemetry data. They read every cruising guide, every forum post, every blog entry they could find about Caribbean sailing. In March 2020, they finally found her, a 1998 Hallberg Rasse 42, impeccably maintained by a single owner, lying in a marina in Fort Lauderdale. They paid $185,000 for her, the proceeds from selling their Seattle home and downsizing to a small condo. They named her Careful Planning, which should tell you everything about their approach to this adventure. Over the next year, Richard transformed that boat into what he believed was an unsinkable fortress. He installed a new Raymarine navigation system with radar and AIS. He replaced every through-hull fitting. He upgraded the standing rigging with oversized wire. He added a water maker, a wind generator, solar panels, and a backup handheld VHF radio to complement the fixed installation. He installed jacklines that ran the entire length of the deck and bought top-of-the-line inflatable PFDs for both of them. The life raft was inspected and repacked. The EPIRB was registered and tested. The flares were fresh. The medical kit could have supplied a small clinic. Caroline created a provisioning system that would have impressed a logistics manager. She had spreadsheets tracking every item aboard, its location, its expiration date, and its replacement schedule. They had 3 months of non-perishable food stored in labeled waterproof containers. They had backup supplies for the backup supplies. Their approach to preparation wasn't just thorough, it was obsessive, and that obsession felt like a life insurance policy. Their shakedown cruise began in November 2021. They spent 6 weeks sailing down the intracoastal waterway, learning every quirk of their boat in the controlled environment of protected waters. Then came the real test, the passage from Fort Lauderdale to the Bahamas. It was textbook perfect, following winds, calm seas, excellent visibility. They anchored in the Abacos, and Richard wrote in the logbook that night, "Everything worked exactly as planned. This boat is ready for anything." Over the next 18 months, they proved it. They sailed through the Bahamas, learning to navigate coral reefs and shallow banks. They made the jump to the Turks and Caicos, then to the Dominican Republic. They cleared customs in Puerto Rico and sailed the island chain down through the Leeward Islands, Antigua, Guadeloupe, Martinique, St. Lucia. Each passage expanded their confidence. Each landfall validated their preparation. By May 2023, Richard and Caroline had logged over 4,000 nautical miles. They'd weathered one proper blow off the coast of Hispaniola, with sustained winds to 35 knots and seas to 12 feet, and careful planning had handled it beautifully. They'd navigated at night in rain, in reduced visibility. They'd dealt with equipment failures, the minor kind that every cruiser encounters and learns to fix. A fouled anchor, a blown fuse in the refrigeration system, a frayed halyard that Richard replaced at sea. Nothing they couldn't handle, nothing that shook their confidence. If anything, each challenge overcome made them more certain of their competence. They'd earned the right to feel capable. They'd put in the hours, done the training, bought the right gear, and logged the miles. They were no longer novices. They were experienced offshore sailors. The passage they planned next was one they'd read about dozens of times, from Grenada to Bonaire, crossing the lower Caribbean, to reach the Dutch islands off the Venezuelan coast. Sailors call this route the Boulevard because it's so straightforward, so well-traveled, so reliably benign. The prevailing winds are from the east, giving you a comfortable beam reach the whole way. The seas are typically moderate, in the 6 to 8 foot range, with long period swells. There are no reefs to worry about, no shoals to navigate, just open water with a clearly defined destination. The marine forecast for late May showed exactly what you'd expect. Trade winds at 15 to 20 knots, seas at 6 feet, scattered clouds, 0% chance of precipitation. It was a forecast so boring it was almost guaranteed. The passage would take roughly 40 hours. They'd leave Grenada in the morning, sail through one night, and arrive in Bonaire the following afternoon. Easy, safe, the Boulevard. On the evening before their departure, they had dinner at a waterfront restaurant in St. George's with another cruising couple they'd befriended, Mark and Jennifer from a Caliber 40 called Second Wind. The conversation turned, as it always did, to the next passage. Richard spread out a chart on the table between the plates of grilled mahi-mahi and explained their route. "Straight shot," he said, tracing the line with his finger. 270 nautical miles, nothing in the way, perfect conditions. The Boulevard. Mark nodded approvingly. Jennifer asked about their routing, and Caroline pulled out her tablet to show them the weather window. "Textbook," Jennifer said. "You guys have this dialed in." They toasted with cold Caribs, the local beer, and talked about meeting up in Bonaire in a few weeks. As they walked back to the dinghy that night, Caroline said something that Richard would remember later with bitter clarity. "Doesn't it feel good to finally know what we're doing?" Richard squeezed her hand. "We've earned it," he said. At dawn on May 23, 2023, Richard and Caroline motored out of Prickly Bay, Grenada, under a sky painted orange and pink by the rising sun. The morning was flawless. A light breeze from the east-northeast, the sea like rumpled silk. Richard made a note in the logbook. Ojo 6:30, departed Prickly Bay. All systems functioning, forecast favorable. Crew rested and ready. Estimated arrival, Bonaire, May 25th, 1400 hours. By 7 a.m., they'd cleared the western tip of Granada and shut down the engine. The sails filled with a satisfying snap, and careful planning settled into her groove, slicing through the water at 6 knots. The autopilot hummed quietly, making minor corrections to keep them on course. Richard went below to make breakfast, while Caroline took the first watch. Scrambled eggs, toast, fresh papaya, and coffee. They ate in the cockpit, watching Grenada shrink astern until it was just a blue smudge on the horizon. The first day was everything a Caribbean passage should be. The wind held steady at 18 knots. The seas built gradually to 6 feet, long swells that lifted careful planning gently and set her down again in a rhythm that was almost hypnotic. They fell into their watch rotation, 4 hours on, 4 hours off. During her watches, Caroline listened to audiobooks, one earbud in, so she could still hear any change in the wind or the rigging. During his watches, Richard monitored their position, checked the weather, and enjoyed the solitude of the night sea. The stars that first night were spectacular, the Milky Way a dense river of light overhead. At midnight, Richard wrote in the log, 6000, position 12 degree latin, 63 degree 42 W. Course 260 degree magnetic, speed 6.2 knots, wind east-northeast 18 knots, seas 6 feet, all well. The Boulevard lives up to its reputation. He allowed himself a small smile of satisfaction. This was what they'd worked for. This was the payoff for all those years of planning and preparation. But something happened during the second day that neither of them remarked upon at the time, though it would become crucial later. The routine of the passage, the steady wind, the unchanging horizon, the predictable motion of the boat created a kind of hypnotic monotony. There's a psychological phenomenon that psychologists call vigilance decrement, where sustained attention to a task that requires monitoring but provides little stimulation leads to a gradual decline in alertness. Pilots experience it on long-haul flights, security guards experience it during night shifts, and sailors experience it on passages like this one, where everything goes right for so long that your brain starts to tune out. Caroline noticed it first, though she didn't identify it as a problem. During her afternoon watch on the second day, she realized she'd been staring at the horizon for 20 minutes without actually seeing it. Her mind had wandered to their plans for Bonaire, to the restaurants they'd visit, to whether they'd finally get the water maker fully dialed in. When she snapped back to attention, nothing had changed. The wind was the same, the seas were the same, the course was the same. She checked the chart plotter. They were exactly where they should be, making excellent progress. She checked the horizon for ship traffic. Nothing. She checked the sails, the rigging, the instruments. Everything perfect. She went below to use the head, and when she came back up 5 minutes later, she'd forgotten to scan the horizon again. It didn't seem important. Nothing ever changed out here. Richard fell into the same trap during his evening watch. The sun set in a blaze of orange and red, and twilight faded into night. He switched on the navigation lights, the red and green glow at the bow, the white stern light. He checked the radar. A single target, a cargo ship 15 miles to the south, heading west. No danger. He updated their position in the logbook. He went below to heat up some leftover pasta for dinner. When he came back up 15 minutes later, he'd left the radar on the 12-mile range, instead of switching it to 6 miles for better resolution of closer targets. It was a small thing, an oversight born of routine and confidence, the kind of mistake that experienced sailors make when everything has been going right for too long. At 2200 hours, Caroline came up to relieve Richard for the night watch. "Anything to report?" she asked. Richard shook his head. "Smooth as silk. Same course, same wind, same everything. We'll cross into Bonaire waters around dawn." He gave her a quick kiss. "Wake me if anything changes, but I doubt it will." He went below, and within 5 minutes, Caroline could hear him snoring softly in the forward cabin. She settled into the cockpit, pulled a fleece around her shoulders against the night chill, and scanned the horizon. Empty. The stars blazed overhead. The wind sang in the rigging. The autopilot steered its precise course. She checked the chart plotter. They'd covered 190 nautical miles, 80 miles to go. They'd be anchored in Bonaire by tomorrow afternoon, sharing sundowners with Mark and Jennifer, swapping stories about the easiest passage they'd ever made. She didn't look at the radar. At 2317 hours, while Caroline was below making herself a cup of tea, a fishing vessel called the Maria Constanza, 32 feet long, unlit except for a single dim working light on its stern, crossed directly into Careful Planning's path 2 miles ahead. The Maria Constanza was owned by a Venezuelan fisherman named Carlos Ruiz, who'd been fishing illegally in international waters for 3 days, his nets spread in a long line behind his boat. He'd turned off his navigation lights to avoid detection by the Coast Guard patrols that occasionally swept through the area. He wasn't monitoring his radar because he didn't have radar. He wasn't monitoring his VHF radio because the battery was dead. He was below deck, sleeping off exhaustion, while his boat drifted slowly northeast on the current, its nets creating an invisible barrier 300 yards long. When Caroline came back up from the galley with her tea, she glanced at the chart plotter, which showed open water ahead. She didn't look at the radar, which would have shown the target, now less than a mile away. She didn't scan the horizon with binoculars, which might have picked up the faint glow of the Maria Constanza's stern light. She sat down, took a sip of tea, and looked up at the stars, thinking about how lucky they were to be living this life. At 2334 hours, Careful Planning, traveling at 6.3 knots, struck the Maria Constanza's fishing net. The impact wasn't dramatic. There was no crash, no violent collision. Just a slight shudder that ran through the hull, followed by a change in the boat's motion, a sluggishness in her response to the swells. Caroline felt it instantly. She set down her tea and stood up, her nurse's instincts triggering a flood of adrenaline. Something was wrong. She looked over the side but saw nothing in the darkness. She checked the speed indicator. They'd slowed from 6.3 knots to 4.1 knots. She checked the chart plotter. Nothing shown as an obstruction. She looked at the radar for the first time in over an hour and saw the target now a quarter-mile behind them off the starboard quarter. "Richard," she called down the companionway. "Something's wrong. We hit something." She heard him curse, heard the thump of his feet hitting the cabin sole, and then he was up in the cockpit beside her, his hair wild from sleep, his eyes struggling to focus. "What happened?" he demanded. "I don't know," Caroline said. "We hit something. The speed dropped. There's a boat behind us on the radar, maybe a quarter mile." Richard grabbed a flashlight and went forward, clipping his safety harness to the jackline. He leaned over the bow pulpit, shining the light down into the water. What he saw made his stomach drop. Wrapped around the keel, tangled in the rudder and trailing back for what looked like 50 yards or more, was heavy fishing net, the thick nylon mesh bristling with floats and lead weights. "We're fouled!" he shouted back to Caroline. "Fishing net! It's wrapped all around the keel and rudder!" He came back to the cockpit, his mind racing through options. This was bad, but manageable. They'd trained for emergencies. They had procedures. "We need to stop the boat and assess the situation," he said. Caroline was already furling the jib. Richard started the engine and put it in neutral, then dropped the mainsail. Careful Planning wallowed in the swells, her forward progress arrested by the drag of the net. Richard went below and grabbed his dive knife, a mask and a flashlight. "I'm going over to cut us free," he said. Caroline grabbed his arm. "Not at night," she said firmly. "We wait for dawn. It's only 3 hours. We're not in immediate danger." Richard wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. Diving in the dark, in open ocean, with boat traffic around, was how you turned a problem into a tragedy. They spent the next 3 hours in a state of tense vigilance, the engine idling to maintain steerage, both of them on deck watching for any sign of the fishing boat or other traffic. At dawn, as grey light spread across the eastern horizon, Richard donned his mask and went over the side. What he found was worse than he'd feared. The net wasn't just wrapped around the keel and rudder, it had wound itself into the propeller shaft, jamming the props so thoroughly that the engine was useless. The nylon mesh was thick, industrial grade, designed to haul in massive catches of fish, and it had tangled into a Gordian knot of biblical proportions. Richard sawed at it with his dive knife for 20 minutes, his arms burning, his breath coming in gasps, and he managed to cut away perhaps 10% of it. At this rate, it would take him hours to cut them free, and even then, the damage to the propeller and shaft might be severe enough to prevent them from motoring. He climbed back aboard, exhausted and shivering. "It's going to take a long time," he told Caroline. "Maybe 6 or 8 hours of cutting, and I'll need to rest between dives. And even if I get it all cleared, I don't know if the prop will turn." Caroline looked at their position on the chart plotter. They drifted during the night, pushed northeast by the current. They were now 65 miles from Bonaire. "Can we sail without the rudder?" she asked. Richard shook his head. "Not effectively. The rudder's jammed by the net. We have some steering with the sails, but not enough to make controlled progress." They looked at each other, the reality of their situation settling in. They were disabled, drifting in open water. This is where the real danger of the Boulevard revealed itself. It wasn't the weather. It wasn't the sea state. It wasn't the presence of reefs or rocks. It was the psychology of complacency. Because this passage was so safe, so routine, so heavily traveled, Richard and Caroline had made the same mistake that dozens of sailors before them had made. They'd allowed their vigilance to slip. They hadn't maintained a proper radar watch. They hadn't scanned the horizon regularly. They'd assumed that because nothing had gone wrong for 200 miles, nothing would go wrong for the last 80 miles. And that assumption had led them directly into a scenario they were unprepared for. The next 4 hours were spent in backbreaking labor. Richard made 4 more dives, each time cutting away more of the net, but progress was agonizingly slow. The net seemed to regenerate itself, loose ends wrapping around the keel as fast as he could cut them away. By noon, he was exhausted, his hands cramping, his skin pruned and raw from the salt water. Caroline took over for 2 dives, but she was a less experienced diver, and her progress was even slower. By 1400 hours, they'd cleared perhaps 60% of the net, but the rudder was still jammed, and the propeller shaft was still fouled. And then the weather changed, not dramatically, not into some horrific storm that you could point to and say, that's what doomed them. No, the change was subtle. The wind, which had been a steady 18 knots from the east, shifted to the southeast and strengthened to 25 knots. The seas, which had been a manageable 6 feet, built to 8 feet with a shorter period, creating a steep, confused chop. For a boat under full control, these conditions would have been uncomfortable, but not dangerous. For careful planning, disabled and wallowing, they were a serious problem. Without the ability to steer or motor, they were at the mercy of the wind and waves. The boat rolled heavily in the troughs, 40 degrees to port, then 40 degrees to starboard. The rigging clattering, loose items down below, crashing from one side of the cabin to the other. Richard tried to rig a drogue, a sea anchor that would keep the bow pointed into the waves and reduce the rolling. But in the building seas, deploying it from the disabled boat was nearly impossible. He got the drogue over the side, but without the ability to maneuver, it didn't set properly, and they ended up dragging it alongside, which only made the motion worse. By 1800 hours, both of them were seasick, exhausted, and starting to feel the first whispers of genuine fear. They'd been in the water for 20 hours. They'd made distress calls on the VHF, but they were beyond the range of any Coast Guard station, and no vessels had responded. They'd activated their EPIRB, which was broadcasting their position to rescue satellites, but rescue in this part of the Caribbean could take 12 to 24 hours. As darkness fell on their second night adrift, Caroline went below to try to rest, but the violent motion of the boat made sleep impossible. She wedged herself into the quarter berth and closed her eyes, but every few seconds, a particularly violent roll would slam her against the bulkhead. She thought about all their preparation, all their careful planning. all the systems and backup systems they'd installed, and she realized with a sick clarity that none of it mattered. They'd prepared for storms, for equipment failures, for medical emergencies. They hadn't prepared for the most insidious danger of all, their own complacency. At Doju 400 hours on May 25th, 42 hours after they'd departed Grenada, Caroline heard a sound that made her blood freeze. A deep, resonant crack, like a tree branch snapping, followed by a tremendous crash on the deck above. She scrambled up the companionway to find Richard standing in the cockpit, staring forward in shock. The mainmast, weakened by the constant violent rolling and the stress on the rigging, had failed at a point 6 feet above the deck. The upper two-thirds of the mast, complete with boom, sails and all the rigging attached to it, had toppled over the starboard side and was now dragging in the water like a massive sea anchor. The boat, already rolling heavily, was now heeling over at a dangerous angle, held down by the weight of the mast and rigging in the water. Richard moved on autopilot, the training kicking in even through the fog of exhaustion and fear. He grabbed bolt cutters and went forward, Caroline right behind him. They had to cut the rigging free before the mast dragged them over or punched a hole in the hull. The shrouds and stays were thick stainless steel cable, and the bolt cutters barely made a dent. Richard sawed at the turnbuckles with a hacksaw, sparks flying in the darkness, salt spray lashing his face. It took 20 minutes to cut through the first stay. The mast was still attached by 3 more shrouds and the backstay. Caroline took over with the hacksaw, her arms screaming with fatigue, while Richard worked on another stay with the bolt cutters. Cut, rest, cut, rest. Finally, at 05:12 hours, the last shroud parted, and the mast, with all its rigging and sails, sank into the Caribbean Sea like a falling tree. The boat rolled upright, and for a moment there was blessed stillness. But now careful planning was completely disabled. No mast, no sails, no engine, no rudder. Just a hull, drifting in 8-foot seas, 60 miles from land. Richard and Caroline sat in the cockpit, too exhausted to speak, watching the sky lighten in the east. They'd been at sea for 50 hours. They hadn't slept more than a few minutes. They were dehydrated, seasick, and in shock. But they were alive, and their EPIRB was still broadcasting. The rescue came at 14:30 hours that afternoon. A Venezuelan Coast Guard cutter, the Simon Bolivar, picked up their EPIRB signal and diverted to investigate. They found careful planning wallowing in the swells, her deck a tangle of cut rigging and debris, her crew huddled in the cockpit, sunburned and exhausted. The Coast Guard took them aboard, gave them water and medical attention, and attempted to take careful planning in tow. But the damage was too extensive. The net still fouled in the running gear, the broken mast stump, the flooded engine compartment where seawater had poured in through a loosened stuffing box during the violent rolling, all combined to make her unsalvageable. At 16:20 hours, the captain of the Simon Bolivar made the decision to abandon her. Careful planning, the boat that Richard and Caroline had poured their life savings and their dreams into, the boat they'd meticulously prepared and maintained, was left to drift and eventually sink in the Caribbean Sea. The investigation that followed revealed the chain of errors with brutal clarity. The fishing vessel Maria Constanza had been operating illegally without navigation lights or functioning radio. That was Carlos Ruiz's responsibility, and he would face charges. But Richard and Caroline's role in the disaster was equally clear. The radar data, recovered from careful planning's chart plotter before she sank, showed that the Maria Constanza had been visible on radar for over 20 minutes before the collision. If either Richard or Caroline had been maintaining a proper radar watch, they would have seen the target, altered course, and avoided the net entirely. The passage from Grenada to Bonaire, the Boulevard, is indeed one of the safest in the Caribbean, but it's also one of the most heavily traveled by commercial fishing vessels, many of them operating illegally with minimal or no navigation lights. The very thing that makes the route safe, the presence of constant marine traffic, is also what makes it dangerous if you let your guard down. Maritime psychologists have a term for what happened to Richard and Caroline: automation complacency. Sanike, when systems work reliably for extended periods, human operators gradually transfer their trust from their own vigilance to the automation. The autopilot was steering perfectly, so they stopped actively navigating. The weather was stable, so they stopped actively monitoring it. The passage was safe, so they stopped actively watching for danger. It's the same psychological trap that causes airline pilots to miss critical warnings when autopilot is engaged, and it's killed more sailors than storms ever have. The wreckage of dreams like Richard and Caroline's litters the Caribbean seabed. In the 5 years prior to their accident, 12 other vessels were disabled or lost in the same stretch of water between Grenada and Bonaire. 3 of those were total losses. In every single case, the investigation revealed the same pattern: experienced sailors, well-prepared boats, and a catastrophic failure of vigilance during a routine passage. The fishing nets are always there. The unlit fishing boats are always there. The cargo ships running without AIS in the wrong shipping lanes are always there. But because the passage is labeled safe, sailors approach it with less caution than they would approach a passage known to be dangerous. And that paradox is exactly what kills them. Richard and Caroline Breslin recovered physically from their ordeal. The Coast Guard delivered them to Bonaire, where they spent 3 days in a hotel, sleeping, eating, and trying to process what had happened. The loss of careful planning was covered by insurance, but the emotional toll was devastating. They'd lost not just a boat, but their dream, their home, their carefully constructed new life. Richard fell into a deep depression that lasted months. Caroline threw herself into volunteer work at a medical clinic, trying to find purpose in helping others. They didn't sail again for 2 years. When they finally did, it was on a chartered boat in the San Juan Islands, a cautious, tentative step back toward the water. Richard told me, when I interviewed him for this investigation, that he wakes up sometimes in the night, still feeling the motion of careful planning rolling in those 8-foot seas, still hearing the crack of the mast failing. "We thought we'd prepared for everything," he said. "We thought we'd earned the right to relax, but the ocean doesn't care what you've earned. It doesn't care how prepared you are. It only cares about what you're doing right now, in this moment." And in that moment, we weren't paying attention. The lesson of the Boulevard extends far beyond sailing. It's a lesson about the danger of complacency in any endeavor where the stakes are high. It's a lesson about how success can breed the conditions for failure, how competence can create blind spots, how the very thing that makes you feel safe can be the thing that destroys you. Richard and Caroline weren't unlucky. They weren't victims of some unforeseeable disaster. They were victims of a psychological trap that catches experienced people more often than novices, because novices are always vigilant, always afraid, always checking and double-checking. Experienced people trust their experience, and sometimes the trust is misplaced. The Caribbean Sea still calls to sailors. The Boulevard is still one of the most popular routes for cruisers heading to the Dutch islands. The fishing boats still operate there, many of them still without lights, still spreading their nets in the darkness. And sailors still make the passage every day, most of them arriving safely, congratulating themselves on their careful planning and their competent execution. But somewhere in that stretch of water right now, there's a boat on autopilot, its crew below making dinner or reading a book, confident that nothing will go wrong because nothing has gone wrong so far. And they won't see the danger until it's too late, because they've fallen into the same trap that caught Richard and Caroline. If you sail, if you venture offshore, if you trust your life to a boat and the sea, remember this story. Remember that the most dangerous passages aren't always the ones with the worst reputations. Sometimes they're the ones that everyone says are safe. Remember that your preparation, your equipment, your experience, none of it matters if you're not paying attention in the moment when it counts. Remember that the ocean is always watching, always waiting for the moment when you look away. And most importantly, remember that there's no such thing as a routine passage. Every mile of water you cross demands your respect, your vigilance, and your full attention. Because the moment you believe you're safe is the moment you're in the most danger of all. Richard and Caroline's story is a tragedy, but it's also a gift. It's a lesson written in wreckage and fear and loss, offered freely to anyone willing to learn from it. They paid the price for their complacency so that you don't have to. Honor their experience by never making the same mistake. Stay vigilant, stay humble, and never ever trust the Boulevard.